Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Adler, Director of Events for Parnassus Books, and it is my absolute pleasure to say welcome and thanks for joining us tonight as we feature Jonathan Escoffery, who's here with his incredible new book, If I Survive You. Now, just as a reminder, you can buy signed copies of If I Survive You from Parnassus Books. And we're going to go ahead and make the link to purchase available for you. Also, Jonathan has agreed to take questions tonight. So whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and ask those questions in the chat or in the comments, and he will do his very best to answer those throughout the course of the evening. So we are thrilled, as I said, to be hosting Jonathan Escoffery. This is his debut book, and he is already an award-winning author. He has received the Plimpton Prize. He has received a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship and ASME Award for Fiction. I'm not even sure if that's all of them, but that's enough for now. And we are extra excited because tonight he's in conversation with Gabriela Garcia, a fellow award-winning author. She wrote Of Women and Salt. So two incredible authors, one amazing evening. I am so thrilled to turn it over to Jonathan Escoffery and Gabriela Garcia.
Hello, so thrilled to be here to celebrate If I Survive You, an incredible book. So excited to talk to my friend Jonathan Escoffery. So I think before we launch into the conversation, I think you're going to read a portion from the book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just thank you so much for doing this with me. This is going to be lots of fun, and I really appreciate it. So I'm going to be reading from the very opening of If I Survive You. And the book is a linked story collection. So this, in a sense, is operating as the opening chapter, but it is also a standalone story. And it's titled Influx. And I'll just read for a few minutes, so not forever. It begins with, "What are you?" hollered from the perimeter of your front yard when you're 9, younger probably. You'll be asked again throughout junior high and high school, then out in the world, in strip clubs, in food courts, over the phone, and at various menial jobs. The askers are expectant. They demand immediate gratification. The question lifts you slightly off your pre-adolescent toes, tilting you, not just because you don't understand it, but because even if you did understand this question, you wouldn't yet have an answer. Perhaps it starts with, what language is your mother speaking? This might be the genesis, not because it comes first, but because at least on this occasion, you have some context for the question when it arrives. You immediately resent this question. Why does your mother talk so funny? Your neighbor insists. Your mother calls to you from the front porch, has called from this perch overlooking the sloping yard since you were allowed to join the neighborhood kids and play. Always, this signals that playtime is over. Only now, shame has latched itself to the ritual. Perhaps you'd hoped no one would ever notice. Perhaps you'd never noticed it yourself. Perhaps you ask in shallow protest, what do you mean, what language? Maybe you only think it. Ultimately, you mutter, English. She's speaking English, before going inside, head tucked in embarrassment. In this moment, for the first time, you are ashamed of your mother, and you are ashamed of yourself for not defending her. More than to be cowardly and disloyal, though, it's shameful to be foreign. If you've learned anything during your short residence on Earth, you've learned this. It's America, and it's the 80s, and at school, in class, you pledge to one and one flag only, the Stars and Stripes. Greatest country on earth is the morning anthem. It's the lesson plan, a mantra drilled into you day in, day out, a fact as inarguable as 2 + 2 = 4. And what you start to hear as you repeat this to yourself is the implication that all other nations, though other nations are seldom mentioned in school, are inferior. You believe this. It's an easy lesson to internalize, except that your brother Delano, your parents, and nearly all your living relatives are Jamaican. When your play cousin moves from Kingston to Miami to your Cutler Ridge neighborhood, winding up in your third grade class, refusing to pledge allegiance to your flag, you know to distance yourself from her. You say a quiet thanks that your last names are different. If you'd had any context for the question of what you are when it first came, you might have answered American. You were born in the US and you've got the paperwork to prove it. You feel pride in this fact, this inalienable status. You belt Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA on the 4th of July, and even more emphatically after visiting your parents' island nation for 2 weeks in your ninth summer. You disagree with every aspect of the island life, down to the general lack of central air conditioning. You prefer burgers and hot dogs to jerked or curried anything. Back at home, your parents accuse you of speaking and even acting like a real Yankee. But if by Yankee they mean American, you embrace it. I speak English, you respond. Your parents' patois and what many deem an indecipherable accent still play as normal, almost unnoticeable against your ears, except that it is increasingly paired with the punitive. For instance, when your mother says, "When I can spill the thing on the tile, but when I can't clean it," and your brother says, "No me, mommy," and you say, "I didn't do it, mom," she'll say, "Then who did? Must be a duppy." The duppy becomes the scapegoat for all of the inexplicable activity that takes place in and outside your house. The duppy broke your mother's vase, then tried to glue it back together. The duppy hid your brother's report card underneath his mattress. The duppy possessed your father, dragged his body out for drinks after work, and didn't bring him home until morning. A duppy, or ghost, or even a grown man can be difficult to discipline, so you and your brother alone share the punishments. In school, when your world geography project is announced and you're made to choose from a list of countries to present on, you choose Mongolia. It's not till another student chooses Jamaica that you consider the tiny island a worthy option. Part of your project requires preparing a dish native to the country you've chosen. This is fourth grade. Your mothers do the cooking. When they meet one another on presentation day, eyes ring dark from having wrestled with foreign recipes late into the night. They nod imperceptibly, too exhausted for pleasantries. As your classmate begins her presentation on Jamaica, your mother sucks her teeth, a sound akin to industrial strength Velcro ripping apart, drawing glances from several of the other parents. "Me could have brought in leftovers," she whispers, leaning in. "If only you chose home." And I'll end the reading there.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a great introduction to the collection and the character Trelawney, who comes up multiple times in the book. And I think it's so like emblematic of one of the things that I really admire about your work, which is the way that you're sort of talking about all of these larger issues about identity and race and class and generational issues. But there's also this underlying very subtle humor. And I think I admire that because I think that's so hard to do, you know? And I think when you do it well, like it heightens the tension and they sort of, you know, work in conjunction. And I'm just curious if that's like something that you deliberately think about when you're writing humor, or if you're just funny. That's what happens.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for seeing the humor, because outside of my head, it's like I can't really call whether or not someone's gonna get it or understand it. I think there's a way in which if I think too hard about it, it becomes harder to be funny on the page. It's like I'll get stage fright. When I first started working with these characters, I was working on a kind of a very short story that never made it into the book. And I don't know that the humor even would have aged very well, but at the time I thought it was this really hilarious story and I wanted to write forward from there. And I had humor kind of front and center on my mind, thinking about what kind of book I wanted to write. And that was one of many things I think that kept me from actually writing the book, thinking it had to be a funny book. And then when I just kind of said, well, let me just see if I can write a good story, a halfway decent story, that's when the humor just kind of naturally started to come back onto the page. And I think it's a good thing that it did, because as you said, I mean, some of these bigger issues that the book is dealing with can be, otherwise like quite heavy when we're thinking about how race is operating, or when we're spending time with Trelawney and his poverty in a sense, and he's discovering dead bodies at time, and all these different, these difficult things are happening, and difficult subject matter. And I'm not somebody who is particularly interested in torturing my reader or torturing myself when I'm in the writing process. And so I like to have, some kind of pleasure in there, and a bit of a good time. And that's how I've dealt with the harder times in my life, I think, with humor. So I think it makes sense to make it onto the page.
Okay. I feel like the answer is that you're actually funny. Like, that's why it's funny, like it has, like, I feel like if you're trying to be funny, it's just like never, it doesn't work. Yeah, I think this, and I think that piece also brings up one of the other things that I think is really interesting in this collection, which is how varied the voices are. Like, every character in this collection has a really distinct voice. Every piece is written in a really different style. You play a lot with point of view. So I'm curious, as you were writing this, like how you were thinking about voice and style, and how you chose which point of view to utilize in each one, or which kind of diction and voice to use in each story.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Influx, which is what I was reading from a moment ago, which opens the book, and it's from Trelawney's point of view, but it's in the second person, and he's saying, you do this, you do that. I think that's probably the voice that's most natural to just how I speak and think in a way. And I tend to be pretty self-deprecating, and I was thinking of this character in a sense, picking apart his lived experience and picking apart some of the, in a sense, the what becomes a run-in motif, I guess, in the book, is this question of, what are you? He's assailed with this question, what are you? And he tries to answer that question, and every time he does, people say, that's not quite right. I know better than you know about yourself. And I wanted to critique those things and show, how it can be really incessant and the damage that could cause, but also at times, like, it's still, I don't know, when you put it back to back, it seems just absurd in a sense. And I think there is a kind of humor that comes out of that. And then there's Trelawney, in a sense, once he's a little bit older. The story starts when he's about 9 years old, but when he becomes a teenager and when he's a young adult, he has more agency to actually make a lot of the decisions that are going to impact his life. And a lot of those decisions may be mistakes. And so I wanted him to, in a sense, be picking apart his mistakes and critiquing, some of the decisions that he's made. And I thought second person would be a really great way for him to have this, in a sense, have a conversation with himself, so that he can kind of figure out where he's gone wrong, I guess, in some cases. Also told in the second person is the following story, which is told from his father's point of view, but that's done in this Jamaican dialect. And I was really just thinking, how would Topper, who, spent, I don't know, almost half his life in Jamaica, he grew up in Jamaica, born in Jamaica, how would he communicate with himself? And I just didn't see any other way to, I guess, accurately or I saw no way to justify writing that in a kind of what we think of as standardized English. I wanted the communication to be how Topper would actually think if he's telling himself this story. And so that voice kind of came from that, which, it's definitely not my Jamaican parents' voices. It's definitely maybe a version of that, though. Thinking about, I have my parents, my family they're Jamaicans, so I have lots and lots of Jamaicans in my life, and their voices I kind of pulled together and had to figure out how to in a sense, create rules for that voice and figure out, how far into the patois are you going to go? I still want people to be able to understand this story for one thing, and I don't just mean like watering it down for American consumption. What I mean is like, people in Jamaica, depending on if you're in Kingston and you went to a university or something, versus people in, a town in Montego Bay who maybe never went to finish high school. Those are going to be different languages in the sense that they're speaking. And so I wanted to just create a rule for it and go with that. And then like a Delano character, the story's told from the third person, but it's in a present tense. And Delano strikes me as this character who's just going to go, go, go. He's going to make a plan and stick to it. And the plan might be bad and the plan might be going wrong at every turn, but he's going to continue to see it through. And so I wanted it in that present tense kind of fast moving pace, if that makes sense. And so to answer your question, I don't know if I did. I was just thinking about like what would a character, what's the psychology of this character and how would they move through the world, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you're thinking about like the character voices, and that's reflected in the actual like diction and pacing. And I guess that makes me like wonder where you start with your stories. Like if they start with that voice in your head, or if there's like an image or a character, like what's the starting point for you when you're sitting down to write a story?
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is to say definitely character. Like I don't start, I mean, I actually would say probably voice before even character, because I really have to hear it. How's this thing going to be told before I can move forward? And then that voice, in a way, the voice and the actions will start to reveal who the character is. And I think, that's a great way for me as the writer of these stories, to learn who those characters are. But there's any number of ways to think about the way I might start a story, including like I think a couple of the stories were started just because I was interested in certain jobs that these characters are working. And so I thought, like, who is the character who would show up for this particular job? And I'm to be honest, I'm obsessed with jobs in fiction, and I love a character who has like a weird job in a story or in a novel. And I love when I can actually learn about the job, or learn how the job is done, or learn how the job's done well versus learning how the job is done very poorly. And I think because I'm somebody who's worked a lot of crappy jobs, I think it's something that makes sense to me. Like I always want to know, where's the money coming from, even if it's, whether that's a lot of money or whether it's very, very little money, such as some of these characters are earning doing their weird jobs. And so I, as someone who would pick up weird gigs off of Craigslist myself, not necessarily the weird gigs that are in this book, but I would come across these weird, little postings that would say, "Hey, come show up at my house and do this." And I would think, wow, that's a really weird thing. Like, who would show up for that, and who would post that? And at one point, Trelawney takes on a job where there's a kind of young-ish couple. No, I shouldn't say young. Late 20s couple who is kind of wealthy, and they want a Black man to show up and watch them in bed, and they're willing to pay for this. And he's desperate enough to show up for this because he's trying to earn money very quickly for many reasons. And so I've seen that ad. I don't know if it was offering money or if it was supposed to be a voluntary kink that someone shows up to satisfy, but I've seen those postings a lot. And so I think, well, who's showing up for that? And also who, I think it fit Trelawney because he's constantly in need of money and a kind of validation that he's looking for. But on the other side of that, like, what is it? What's behind that desire to have this particular body in the room while you're intimate with your partner? And and imagine in a way forward, and imagine in a way like a story out of that was that happened a few times in the construction of this book, I think. So a job may be a way into a story for me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the jobs and the work that happens in the book, because that's some of my favorite scenes. Like I think one of my favorite scenes and one of the funniest for me was when Trelawney is hired to like punch this woman. I think her name is Charity or Chastity. Chastity, right?
Yeah.
And she's, you know, she's like a white woman. I think she's described as being like blonde-haired, blue-eyed or something. And there's like a scene where he's like considering the racial implications of this, and she's like, I'm not white, I'm Latina. And that was just so funny to me, because it's so like emblematic of Miami's like racial politics too, you know, this racial bypassing that happens when people hide behind their own like Latinidad to not even have to question their role in like white supremacy or these like really fucked up anti-Black dynamics. And you know, I think it's one of the things that I really admire in the book too, that it's sort of bucking up against this image of Miami, which is a place that is like rarely represented in literature or even in like popular culture outside of like, I don't know, I feel like every movie I've ever seen about Miami is like South Beach, you know?
Absolutely.
And you're like writing about Cutler Ridge, which is like an hour away from the beach and like closer to the swamp than it is to Miami. And even the way that people from Miami sometimes talk about Miami is this kind of like racial utopia, because it's this, you know, minority majority city, and it's, you know, majority like immigrants, and there's so much mythology around the immigrant success story and how immigrants built this city. And I think your book is really challenging a lot of those notions. So I'm curious, you know, at like you're writing about a place that is seldom represented, like was it like how, you know, was it difficult for you sort of delving into these issues and all of these intricacies that are like so specific to a place that is seldom represented?
Yeah, that was incredibly difficult for me, I think, at first, especially because it's weird because I have the writerly impulse to capture just how strange Miami is. and I do have to, I have to be careful because I don't want to beat up on Miami. It's a city I love. I have, you know, so many loved ones there. And at the same time, I think my desire to not like let out the family secrets in a way, kind of, it was a balance between not wanting to like tell on, I didn't want to snitch on Miami in a sense. And at the same time, I also wondered, well, to capture these nuances, like, will people even get this outside of Miami, and will they believe it, and will they be interested in it, and will they be repulsed by it? And, you know, I had all of those questions, and I really, and also you framed just now, you framed Miami like so well, so perfectly. I think it's difficult, or I'll say it this way, I think it's easy in a majority minority city to ignore some of those racial, some of the racism, some of the problems, because it's easy for everyone to say, what do you mean? Like, I'm, you know, I'm also an immigrant. I'm also minority within the context of the US, or this and that, you know, prejudice. It's like, it's just cultural, you know, and to say those kinds of things. And so I just had to, you know, the book became for me more interesting the more I told the truth as I saw it. And so I just had to go forward and do that. And one thing I want to say, like that particular story that Trelawney shows up for, that's an ad. I mean, I saw that ad essentially, and I wanted to write forward from that. And my favorite part of that story is that same moment that you're talking about, where, you know, that statement that she makes, I'm brown, I'm Latina, is it results from the story that she tells about how her father beat her sister for bringing a Black boy into the house, but it turns out that the Black boy wasn't Black at all because he was South Asian. And Trelawney has shown up for this job, even though he's not supposed to, because the ad said no Black guys, but he kind of a lot of people call him mulatto in Miami, and they're like, you're kind of, you know, you're not like that kind of Black. And so he's like, well, I'm desperate for money. So it's, to me, it's like this weird thing where it's like, identity and race is kind of like this fluctuating thing in a way. And it's almost like, well, if you have a prejudice, it's almost like if you're anti-Black, your prejudice is attached to that idea and that word, but not necessarily like all of the bodies that would fit within that category. And so I just wanted to capture that, again, that strangeness of this place I grew up.
Yeah. And I think, I love that you're sort of challenging some of that, mythology and some of that like rhetoric that happens in Miami. And also I think part of what renders Miami so real to me when I was reading your work is the detail in it too. Like, yeah, like those dynamics and those conversations, like absolutely 100%. And then also just like, crabs scuttling inland when there's a hurricane happening. Or, you even go like to the Keys and lobster trapping and all of this stuff. It's like, it's so specific to place. So I guess I'm really interested just in how you thought about detail when you were writing this and like what your editing process was. Like, do you end up like adding a lot of stuff? Do you end up taking out a lot of stuff? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do end up taking out a lot of stuff, and I think it takes time to take out a lot of stuff. For me, so the lobster trapping was a story that, like, I'd been to the Florida Keys and different parts of the Florida Keys a lot, but I knew nothing about lobster trapping as a job and what that entailed, or even you can get those little, like, when it's lobster season, anyone can get like the little license to just go out and catch lobsters for whatever given amount of time. And I'd never done any of that. I'd never seen a lobster in the wild. So I had to do a lot of research. And I think because I did so much research for that job, in an earlier draft of that story is called Splashdown. I think I overdid it. I wanted to name every boat in the marina, and I wanted to not just put a name on them, but also describe like what kind of boats they were. And I was getting so granular with all of these details that it was too much. It was way too much, and I had to pare back. And for me, I think the details in my book work best when I am going simple and I'm just sticking with the significant details. I know my brain, like, for when I read, I get overloaded by too much description in a way. I prefer those simple details. Like if the character walks into a room and they describe every detail of the room, and it's not really significant to like what's actually happening in the story, or I can't seem to gain the or understand the significance. For me, it feels like dead weight. And so my goal in the book was just to pare down and think about, okay, here is a simple image. Let's allow the reader to hang on to this simple image and keep with that until there's another simple image that we can, trade off for and keep it moving in that kind of way. But those images, they came from a lot of memory mining, and they came from research, and I try to be accurate. But I think the other thing, I taught a class for The Porch earlier today. There may be some of those students possibly here. I was talking about description as not so much just trying to be accurate, but description as a method of showing the character's emotional state or their psychological state and revealing character through those descriptions. And to me, I think that's something that I'm really interested in.
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting too. Like, what are the details that actual character would notice?
Yeah.
What does that say about themselves? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And they might describe, Miami, if there were a happier character with a lot more money in his pocket, he might describe South Beach, in a totally different way. And it's like when this book does get to South Beach, for the little bit that it does, Trelawney is very cynical about what's going on Ocean Drive as he takes his walk down Ocean Drive. If it were a tourist, I got the one the one I got a review that was glowing, and the one thing I took issue with was that I think it said something like there should have been more dancing and more flirting and more food. And I wrote this book to write against that, like that Miami is just South Beach dancing and flirting and exotic foods, scare quotes on the exotic. And so but yeah, another person, another character would see it differently, and this is just not that character.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. Like I remember, like, my dad worked in hotels in South Beach, like doing like maintenance work, so I feel like I totally relate to that idea. Like there's the forward presenting part, and then there's like what's actually happening in the background, and like even like the immigrant hustles that you're talking about, like that's
Right.
absolutely happening. Yeah. I love that you go there. And yeah, again, I think what you're talking about, like the dancing and the food and whatever, like it just like is this veneer over like these actual racial tensions that are happening, this actual like immigrant tension that is happening too, between who is like welcomed with open arms in Miami and who is not. Yeah.
And also this, like I tend to talk about there's a flattening of Jamaicans that I sometimes notice, where people believe Jamaica exists for tourism purposes, and those human beings who live there only exist to satisfy your idea of traveling to paradise for a week. But Miami is very much the same. It's like, those clubs on South Beach, they're operating so those people can fly in and spend lots of money and have a fantasy. But real people have to work those jobs and live there. And obviously, like, the book's not just about South Beach, but still, you even as far away as Cutler Ridge, Cutler Bay, you're going to feel that. You're going to feel the ripple effects of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're getting some questions from people. So we have a question from Rhea Borgia. When you sit down to write a new story, do you already know what the plot is? Or do you start with something more nebulous, like an image or a phrase? I feel like we talked about this a little bit, but do you want to add to that?
Sometimes I know what the plot is, and I'll say the hardest stories to write are the ones that I think I know what the plot is, because now I need to kind of stick to. It's like the more if it's an idea of here are events that are going to happen, maybe I don't have to stick to it so rigidly. But if I think I know, oh, this is like an amazing plot turn, it's going to pivot this way and then that way, and that's going to keep readers like on the seat of their pants. It turns out to be that those are the hardest stories to write, because I'm trying to actually, at the same time I'm doing all that, this roller coaster, blah, 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 I'm trying to figure out who this character is. And the more I figure out about them, those things may not align very well. They may not, that character who I start to love may, give me the impression that they actually wouldn't do that thing that would lead to that, brilliant plot turn as I imagined it. And so those can be difficult. Anytime I think I have a brilliant plot, I have to just kind of back away slowly and understand that it may not work out that way.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like sometimes the story just like doesn't earn the ending that you originally wanted for it,
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Susanna Feltz. I love that you're interested in depicting work. Are there other jobs, places of employment, etc., that you'd like to explore in fiction, or that you have explored in other stories?
That's a really great question. I'm working on a story. I don't know when I'm going to pull this story off. I had a friend who worked in a it was a clinic that catered to people with eating disorders, and some of the, in one way it's like, that's not my story to tell because I don't have the personal experience with it aside from that secondhand storytelling, but there are ways in which the character that I've been working on putting in that story, like he does have a lot of similarities to some of like my personal experience, but it's an environment that I think could be explored more in fiction, whether I'm the one to write it or not. I'm of that thinking that, you know, if you're interested in something, you should write it, and then you should think about whether you should put it out. Think of, you know, maybe you're not the person to write it, or you haven't earned your right to put that story out. So, you know, that may never make its way off of my Word documents, but I think that's a fascinating place. I've written a story that hasn't quite made it out about like an old-timey sheriff kind of person. And it's I'm kind of interested in like law in places that are kind of newly founded, and so they're still trying to figure out, you know, what it is they believe about law and order, and like figuring out how that can go incredibly wrong. Yeah, those are a couple. More I've worked in lots of hotels, and there's a lot more to say about hotels and resorts too, and that I know will be making its way out.
Cool. So we have another question from Rhea Borja. How do you know when a story is quote unquote done? The urge to keep tweaking a story can be irresistible.
It can be. Yeah, you abandon the story, right? I think if you actually think, you know, the story is done insofar as you would be proud to see that story come out in a book, and you'd be proud to see that book on a bookshelf beside, you know, some of your favorite writers or some of the greats. You know, it may not be on that bookshelf right away, but if you feel that proud about the story, then I would say you're probably done with it. Once it goes through, you know, the vetting that these stories need to go through, like editors and maybe an agent or what have you. I think another way to look at it too is that you can endlessly tinker with a story, I mean, but you might realize that there's like a whole other world, a whole other project that's calling to you, and you just have to let like this world that you've been working on for possibly many years, it may be time to let that go, and now you can grow into the writer who is going to learn how to write this next project.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so we have Susanna Feltz. Splashdown is such an amazing story. Its twists and turns and its relationships. Can you tell us a little bit about the drafting process of that one?
Yeah, so in the book, you heard me read from a Trelawney story where Trelawney is, in a sense, trying to figure out who he's going to be in the world. And he has we didn't quite get to this, but he has a very fraught relationship with his father, Topper. And we see throughout the book how that relationship is, in a sense, damaged, and we move towards a place where maybe it could be repaired or maybe not. I was interested in exploring Cookie, the main character in Splashdown, as this kind of parallel character to Trelawney, and then his father, Ox, is a parallel to Topper. And Ox abandoned Cookie when he was a baby, I think after a month or two. And then they reunite, and Cookie meets his father, Ox, for the first time in the Florida Keys the summer he turns 13. And I knew I wanted to have him interested in this question: what kind of man is my father? And I wanted him to think about or be interested in the question of, will my father show me that he will protect me, in a sense? And there's this one part early in the story where he imagines he's swimming in the ocean with his father. His father's taking him out to teach him how to trap lobsters or catch lobsters. And he imagines sinking to the ocean floor just to see if his father would actually save him. And I think that is what he's trying to enact throughout the story, including at the end. He puts himself in a really vulnerable position to see, I think he knows it's a bad move that he's making. He knows he's making himself vulnerable, but he wants to know that his father would save him. And we see, what happens there. And so that was kind of like the thinking parts behind it. I think I did at different times have ideas about like where there were going to be plot turns, because in a way that one, and then the Delano story, which I read from in that class I taught earlier today for the porch, those are probably the more overtly plotted stories. In that one, Delano's trying to steal back his bucket truck before a hurricane makes landfall so he can do a tree trimming job to get his business back on track, so he can get his kids back in his life, because it's such a big contract that he would get a lot of money. And we see the kind of twists and turns that take place. Back to Splashdown, I mean, I thought I knew his father was going to be up to no good at a certain point, and what that no good was that continued to change, and it was something that I had to try to think about. It was almost like, solving the Rubik's Cube, because every time I made him do one thing, it's like something else that he did earlier in the story no longer made sense, or something he was going to do later in the story no longer made sense. And so I kind of tried to simplify it and just think more about, again, what I was saying earlier about Cookie and his need, this kind of raw need to understand whether or not his father loves him. And any plot twist that came after that, like, it had to feel natural, basically. And Cookie becomes a father, and he's also trying to figure out like what kind of father is he going to be, and and we see where that goes in a sense. I think I'll leave that there. I think you're still muted, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I guess that just leads to my last question before we wrap up, which is just how you envision like the structure of this book. Like, you have all of these different voices, all of these different characters. Did you write it like in the order that it appears, or how did you like put it together?
I did not write it in the order that it appears. I knew when I wrote Influx, which opens the book, I knew that I had the book's opening at that point. And I think that story, for some reason, like there's a momentum to that story. And I think in a way it helped me see the entire shape of the book and what the book would be. And I don't know, like after I wrote that story, I started putting them in order. There were still some stories that kind of went in and came out altogether. And then I hadn't yet written the final story. And that was this, it's the longest story in the book. It took a really long time for me to draft, but I knew this was the manuscript at that time was already titled If I Survive You. And I think there's a lot of like characters trying to survive and trying to survive the actions of others. And but I knew that was going to be the title story in a sense. And I knew I was going to write the story in a way that it kind of closed out a lot of the threads that appear earlier in the book. And having those two bookends, Influx and If I Survive You, helped me shift things just a little bit around it. So the way I see it is a kind of handoff of moments, because we start Influx where as I said, Trelawney was 9, and then we follow him over a couple of decades. So he's kind of in his late 20s when that story ends, and he's about to come home from the Midwest, come back to Miami. And then the next story starts all the way back in the 60s. But where that story ends is Trelawney, it ends after the first story. And so it's told in a way that Trelawney has come back. Eventually in that story, Trelawney has come back to Miami, and we see how the father and son are getting along. And that kind of pushes, there's the big rift in the father-son dynamic, and we see the results of that rift in the third story, Odd Jobs. And so there are these tiny handoffs, but a big challenge for me was always, how am I going to do those handoffs and still have a bunch of standalone stories? Because it was important to me that the stories stood alone as well. Yeah, I think I think that's how I went about it. I originally wanted to just write a novel that had like these standalone chapters, and I had to kind of stop thinking of it as a novel, write a bunch of stories, and then bring it back together in this way that a lot of people are calling it a novel. And I'm perfectly happy with whether they call it a novel, novelist stories, or linked stories. It all works for me.
I mean, that's always so interesting to me, right? Like where the boundary is between what are like
Yeah.
chapters and stories, and yeah. So that's cool to hear about your process.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're at the end. Thank you. This was such a fun conversation.
Thank you for all the great questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you haven't gotten it yet, there are like a bunch of signed copies available at Parnassus. Definitely get yours. There's limited supply. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so delighted that I was able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. I think we'll be disappearing.
Okay, do we just disappear?